Good morning, Nat, and thank you very much for joining us to give some time to the Mint.
Thank you, Henry. Delighted to be here and talking with you.
I really enjoyed reading your book, which I thought was, it was really well written and really, I loved it. So um, I thought maybe we'd start. I mean, there's so much in it, but maybe start with the thing that Ricardo is most famous for, which is his theory of free trade. So maybe you could quickly explain it and why it was so revolutionary.
Yeah, of course. Well, delighted that you really like the book. So Ricardo's theory of free trade, known as the theory of comparative advantage, it's been lauded as a beautiful proof of the benefits of free trade. Essentially, what Ricardo showed was that any country, doesn't matter if they're worse at producing everything than any other country, as long as they focus on what they're least worst at, what they're comparatively better at, and then trade that for what the other country is comparatively better at, both countries will benefit. And that will therefore, trade will raise all boats. And so it's been seen as a beautiful proof for globalization.
And so how was it revolutionary?
So the common story that's told is that prior to people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, economic theory was controlled by something called mercantilism, that countries tended to have high tariffs, so taxes on goods going in between, and that Ricardo's theory ushered in an era of free trade, of lower tariffs that essentially made everyone wealthier. And so that's the common story of why Ricardo's idea is revolutionary.
And it was also, was it not, you sort of suggest, in creating a sort of small specific model or simplistic model, that was also methodologically revolutionary, was it?
Yeah, so I part of the story, I argue that David Ricardo should be seen as the other founding father of economics. We often think of Adam Smith as the founding father of economics, and Smith was this moral philosopher who was working in Edinburgh, whereas David Ricardo was the richest stock trader of his era. And Ricardo had a very different way of doing economics that, as you say, was much more abstract. And he wanted to make economics, as he said, a strict science like mathematics. And he believed that he'd discovered these laws or principles of economics that you could then, with these principles, inform real world policy. And so, yeah, so his theory of international trade is probably one of the first models of economics. And the reason why this is important for us today is because we, in the last, few decades, have been guided by similar economists who have wanted to guide real world policy by abstract models. And so I show in many different ways in which that has gone wrong and backfired.
Well, shall we get to that then? Because I suppose your other sort of key argument is that it missed this simple model, missed key complexities of life that told a very different story and would lead to very different conclusions. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so I can start again with the Ricardo example. So the classic example is England and Portugal exchanging cloth and wine. And what I do in the book, and this is partly from inspired by Matthew Watson, who's at Warwick University, and other people have written about it over the years, is that there was a real trade in English cloth and Portuguese wine, but Portugal never exported enough wine to make up for the large amounts of English cloth that they imported. And so, over decades and decades, how did they make up this trade imbalance? Mainly through Brazilian gold, which was being dug in Portugal's colony of Brazil and ended up in London. And that Brazilian gold was dug by enslaved Africans. And actually, a lot of the cloth that entered Portugal only stayed in Portugal for a while before being re-exported to the West African coast to be exchanged for men, women, and children to go and work in the Americas. So actually, instead of this win-win world of Ricardo's English cloth and Portuguese wine, you have a much more historically accurate story of colonialism and empire. And that's just one example of how a very narrow abstract model can actually blind people to huge, important things that are happening in the world.
And I suppose as well, I believe you talked about the fact that Portuguese economic development may also have been held back because they remained as a agrarian economy rather than developing an industrial economy as happened in England.
So I think that's definitely true. And it's sort of a counter to, Ricardo's example seems to say you should specialize in your comparative advantage. And, it makes no sense in his time to have, vast heated greenhouses producing wine in England when you can buy it cheaper from overseas. But it matters what you specialize in. And in specializing in this agricultural commodity, there's a strong argument that Portugal very much limited how much it could develop later on. And yeah, and its economic welfare dipped, and it is sort of became a semi-colonial, part of Britain's informal empire.
And of course, the port houses are all owned by English families, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. I think I'm not an expert on ports, but from what I understand, sort of yes, some if you think of the big names of ports, whether that's Croft or Graham's or others, these are sort of English and Scottish names rather than Portuguese. So actually some of the merchants doing this were yeah, as you say, weren't Portuguese, although some of the large vineyards were owned by the Portuguese elite. And there's other things going on here as well. There was the Portuguese elite could have more control of their country when it was an agricultural country, rather than if they let the merchants have too much power. They were Catholic, and they were quite wary of Protestants coming in and sort of learning new skills from the Dutch and the English. So it's not all about economics, but certainly economics played a big part.
So this great idea of Ricardo's has had amazing longevity, hasn't it? As you say, it's been about globalization. It's still, most economists are up in arms that Trump is questioning free trade and saying that tariffs are a beautiful word, etc. How is it that for 200 odd years this theory has been the crown jewels of economics?
There's an interesting parallel, I think, because comparative advantage is often called a beautiful theory or a beautiful truth. And now we have Trump saying tariffs are beautiful. And actually, I think hopefully most right-thinking people could see these are actually two extremes, and there's a huge area in the middle where you can actually have a debate about what sort of trading system you want. But yeah, you're quite right that certainly in the last sort of 20 to 30 years, especially in the 90s and 2000s, Ricardo and his theory were often invoked to say, if you criticize free trade, you're actually criticizing 200 years of economic theories, 2 centuries and counting. And what I try and break down in the book is actually what I refer to as the birth, the death, and then the rebirth of this idea of guiding policy by abstract theories, and argue that actually, no, for a long time, Ricardo and his reputation were actually completely sidelined, and it's only been in certain times when his theory has been held in such high regard. But yeah, certainly it was during the sort of really what some people have called hyper globalization or go-go globalization of the 90s and the 2000s that Ricardo's theory, I would say, sort of calcified into a dogma. And if you didn't believe in free trade, essentially you couldn't call yourself a serious economist during that time. And that didn't matter if you were left or right. And obviously there have been many other schools of economics, Keynesian, Marxist, developmental schools, but they were often marginalized during this time.
Yes, I recall in Australia in the early 90s working on trade and environment issues in the Department of Environment and meeting people in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and they definitely thought they had the moral high ground. That they were advocates, deep believers in free trade. That they claim that you could look back at the run up to the Second World War and say, look, that was protectionism. It caused a huge war. There was this huge culture, which was quite interesting. It seemed of people who believed in free trade and thought it was morally, the right answer. So environmentalists were seen as the bad guys, which I thought was quite interesting.
That's fascinating. And I guess this one of the stories I tell is that absolute fierce belief in free trade was misused to construct a certain type of globalization that gave new powers to corporations and made them much more wealthy. So I talk about the massive extension of what's called intellectual property or copyright and patent law, which really sort of benefited big pharma. You've got the rise of investor state dispute settlements, sometimes called shadow courts, whereby corporations can take governments to court if they change policies. And you've got the sort of, locking in at a global level of completely unregulated flows of money across borders. And I think in all those areas, Ricardo's theory was used at least rhetorically to justify it, where, actually it had very little to do with that situation. And I think what we're living in is in part a backlash against that sort of very one-sided view of a particular type of globalization. I have a line in the book that says, in the 1990s, people thought that, free trade would make China more democratic, and by the 2020s, it looked like it's made America more authoritarian. Some people might disagree with that, but I think that story is basically true.
Yes, I mean, it does seem to, it certainly makes a lot of sense to me. Do you think economists are going to rethink uh, their uh, their love of Ricardo's free trade theory now? Is he going to go into decline in the economics profession?
So I certainly think that it's more contested than it was. I think you have many people who are still fierce believers and will it will take the turning over of professions in order to change that. But I do think certainly in Washington there has been on all sides, both Democrat and Republican, a an awakening to some of the downsides of unfettered free trade, both for good and ill. But I think you can see that through, the dominance of Europe on Russian gas, the fear about the rise of China, the need to reduce carbon emissions. You can see that in, some of the worries about the hollowing out of certain parts of America and how that has destabilized society. And I think all of that is causing a massive rethink in how trade policy is done. But it seems to me a little bit like it's a lot of practical work that's happening, and almost the theoretical and thinking work is having to follow the practical work. And because we've had this sort of locked in view that tariffs are always bad, that free trade is always good, whatever that word means, free trade, I think that has left us unprepared as we move into this sort of new world.
I think an interesting blog I read recently by Noah Smith on the implications for security and the ability of the US to wage war, in that, war is fundamentally about the ability to produce large amounts of war material, such as currently any future war would be drones, in huge quantity, because initially they'd all get knocked out. And so if you're going to win, you're going to have to keep producing over maybe, a number of years. And he proposed that the US just does not have that manufacturing capacity anymore.
So I think it's really interesting to see the evolution of people's thinking and the realization of just how many things are excluded if you take the very narrow view of free trade, or we can talk about other models and other economic theories as well. And I would argue that, if you read Adam Smith, he talks about the necessity of security. He says defense is more important than opulence at some point. And so I would say he was not a dogmatic thinker, whereas many people since him have been dogmatic, even those who sort of pinned up Adam Smith as their poster child. The caution I'd give to that is one that is echoed by, not echoed, but put forward by Danny Roddick, who says, let's not swap one dogma for another. So we've been led by, a dogma of, free trade, meaning often the enforcement of corporate power, but actually security hawks might just take control of, global trading and decide it's all about security. And that would also be a great problem.
So I suppose what you're suggesting is the challenge for economists is to bring more of the real world into their analysis. How can they, are they going to have to desert their fascination with numbers and their sort of well-known tendency towards having to make everything quantitative into models to do that? Do you see any way forward for the profession to expand its analytical outlook?
So I guess one of the things I try and do in the book in talking about the birth, the death, and the rebirth is essentially to say this type of highly abstract economics has been discredited and overthrown before. Not completely, but we had this whole phase of more historical and institutional economics in Germany, in the UK, in the US, major names, but now major names that have been excluded from the canon and are rarely taught. And so in some ways, it's actually, re-embracing a much broader view of what economics is. And I would argue that engaging with institutions and with history is a way to get more of the real world into the economics curricula and economics textbooks than you have through a very narrow focus. I've got nothing necessarily against numbers in themselves, but I do think they can have a mesmerizing quality. And one of the analogies I use in the book is the Greek myth of Pygmalion. So this was not a story that I really knew a bunch about before, but I've looked into it now, and it's inspired movies like My Fair Lady and more recently Her, which is an AI fantasy. And the story is of this Cypriot sculptor who really dislikes the women he sees around him. So goes back to his study and he chisels this perfect woman and eventually ends up falling in love with her, buying her jewelry and, kissing her and strange things like that. And this is often told as a tale of misogyny. And it is that, but it's also, and this is actually George Box, who's a sort of famous writer on models. He warned economic modelers, do not fall in love with your model, just like Pygmalion. And I think there's a very strong tendency, it can be called the Pygmalion syndrome, of confusing the real world and the model world. And the model world can be so neat and perfect and tied up, and everything goes back to equilibrium and it's beautiful. And it's much nicer to work with than the messy real world. So I think, I think it's going to be uncomfortable and not pleasant for some people to wake up to the fact that they have fallen in love with a statue rather than the real thing.
And then they have to develop some capacity to deal with realities rather than living a lonely, isolated life, I suppose. But that is fascinating, and we will, I'm sure, both of us be keeping involved and seeing how the economics profession does or does not develop, whether it ends up locked in its room continuously with its models and increasingly irrelevant, or actually does try and take on the real world as it is, it's becoming increasingly complex, conflicted, and dangerous.
And I can probably just jump in there and say, my final chapter is called A New Hope, and I argue that, in the last 10 years, we have seen, I think, positive movements to engaging more with reality. And some of that is in the sort of civil society space, like rethinking economics, or indeed promoting economic pluralism and the Mint. And some of that is within sort of, serious economics, mainstream economics too. So one example would be someone like Thomas Piketty having a smash hit with his book looking at inequality and sort of going back to the tax records. And as he says, doing, the first proper quantified, that's numbers, quantified analysis in, 60 years about wealth inequality. But also you've got other types of people, such as, I think a fascinating example is the anti-monopoly or antitrust movement. And so you've got activists, journalists, lawyers, political economists looking at how large a corporation can be, and I think one of the real highlights of the recent Biden administration has been to put some of the leaders of this movement, called the New Brandeis movement, at the top of various regulatory agencies. And they've essentially swept away 40 years of the so-called law and economics movement that said it's all about consumer price. That's the only metric on which you can judge if a corporation is too large. And that has led to a merger mania and very weak enforcement of antitrust laws. And so in some ways, it's about economists themselves changing, but also they might lose territory, they might lose turf. For example, with the New Brandeis movement, it's people saying we need a more reality-based approach rather than relying on outdated assumptions and theories.
Yes, I think that was a fascinating story, actually, where there has been great steps forward, and it's going to be very interesting what happens under Trump, in that the initial signs seem to be that actually the antitrust bent will be continued, possibly, depending, I suppose, if anyone comes along and offers Trump something to counter that. But
yeah, I mean, I'm not very hopeful of what's going to happen under Trump generally, but yeah, yes, there have been mixed messages. JD Vance seems to like Lena Khan, who's been one of the leaders of this, but then Elon Musk equally has said that she's going to be fired soon. And I don't have a huge amount of hope that the number of billionaires that are stuffing his cabinet are going to like the crackdown on corporate profits and excess that Lena Khan has been promoting.
I think you may be right, unfortunately. But thank you very much, Nat. That's been absolutely fascinating, and best of luck with promoting your book. And I hope it gets a really good readership.
I loved it. Thank you, Henry. Good to speak with you.